In this part, we will introduce traditional Chinese cities, palaces, and gardens. Now let's take a look at the Chinese city planning, and we are going to look at two cities. One is the Tang Dynasty capital city of Chang'an, which is in today's city of Xi'an, and another is the Ming and Qing Dynasty, Beijing. So this is on the left is the Chang'an city of China, and it was completed in 582, known as Daxing. It was built during the Sui Dynasty, and later renamed Chang'an after the founding of the Tang Dynasty in the year 618. It has a square plan, and the city at large was divided into checkerboard blocks by wide streets and avenues, and the imperial city is located to the north central of the city, and the imperial city can be divided into a northern palace city and a southern part. The southern part provide offices for different departments for the imperial administration, and the northern part was basically the palace, the residence for the emperor. And the third Tang Emperor Gaozong construct another palace outside the former outer city, and that is called the Damingong, and that is the protruding part on the northeastern wall of the city. So such a city can be compared to, for example, a Roman centuriation city, like those at the one at Timgad in North Africa. Both have kind of square plan and a gated wall, and with kind of thoroughfares inside the city. A major difference is the scale. Each of the small blocks in the city of Chang'an is like the size of a Timgad in the Roman kind of city. So the Chinese city of Chang'an is a huge city, and each of its interior, each of the blocks had their own wall and gate, and it's like a miniature city for their own rights. In the Zhou Dynasty Book of Rites, a section on the craftsmanship, the volume on craftsmanship, indicated that the capital city for the Son of Heaven need to have a square plan, and it should be 9 by 9 li, the Chinese mile, square, and there should be 9 street and running the cardinal direction of east and west, and the 9 avenues running the direction of north-south. The imperial district, according to the Book of Rites, should be in the south, which is referred to as the front, and then the market should be located in the back, which is in the north, etc. and etc. So the Tang Dynasty capital city of Chang'an conform to the Book of Rites ideal imperial city in that it has a square shape, it has kind of roughly 3 gates on each side, and big avenues running north-south, east-west, in the cardinal direction, not quite 9th Street and 9th Avenue, but pretty close. But the difference is here, the imperial quarter is located in the north, which is, according to the Chinese convention, that is in the back, while the market is located in the south. So there are actually two markets, one an eastern market and a western market. So so here, so this is the imperial city, and this is the palace city. This is the eastern market, and this is the western market. And this is the Damingong, constructed by the third emperor Gaozong. This is the gate, the southern gate to Damingong, called the Hanyuan Dian, the Hanyuan Hall. Features a huge platform, embracing arms, elevating 3-section gate towers, and a big hall located in the center, guarding the southern entrance to the palace. The one feature of the Tang Dynasty Chang'an is its scale, the grand scale of Chang'an. For example, the main north-south avenue is about 200 meters wide. This street, 200 meter wide. So you get a sense of the scale of the city. 200 meter, that means you can fit 2 soccer field along its width. 2 soccer field along its width. So it's basically a very long, elongated square, very wide. Now we can understand why each of those blocks is actually like a small city. So this is basically a city, a collection of cities, and the number of the cities inside is also symbolic. There are 108 of them. 108 is a very important number because according to the Chinese constellation, there are 36 imperial constellations, and then there are 72 earthly branches. So the total is 108. So those are the major, heavenly and earthly kind of divinity. That was the, the total number, 108. So each of those little rectangle is a city. By all means, they all have wall. They are walled. So those big avenues, seemingly big avenues, are not like the street as we might imagine for a modern city where you can do business, you can have all kinds of activity. They are just big avenues that separate those cities, and each of those cities also had their walls and gate. So on those streets, what you can see are actually city walls and gates, and so it's that kind of a city. Tang Dynasty record indicate those broad streets are lined with locust trees and having a drainage system. And the gates and the main streets were divided into 3. The middle thoroughfare was reserved for the emperor, so it was a hierarchical city. Residential wards are also walled and separated from the road with gates that are locked at night. And the hierarchy can also observed in the city. Those closer to the imperial quarters are wider, and those are more elite wards. The officials and the members for the expanded imperial family live in those wards which are closer to their offices, to the emperor, and the southern part of the city are not as prestigious, and the markets are located in between. Common folks were not allowed to open their gate on the ward walls, but high officials can have direct access to the street. So that hierarchy was also expressed in the degrees of freedom. Those high-ranking residents had free access, can buy, for which they can to the streets, for which they can bypass the night curfew. Such a restricted, controlled existence did not bode well for commercial life, which requires mobility of people and goods, and the system was discontinued in the 10th century. Actually, by the later part of Tang Dynasty, there were already some commercial local city in the Yangtze River area that had busy nightlife, that the ward system already pretty much disbanded in those local cities, but the official capital had that restrictions and hierarchical expression with a very kind of highly controlled urban life in the Tang capital. Now let's take a look at the Ming-Qing Beijing. So the two plans are again drawn to the similar scale. The Ming-Qing Beijing, like the Tang Dynasty Chang'an, also has many layers, and those layers express hierarchy, right? For example, they both have a palace city, and they both have an imperial city. The palace city was the residence for the emperor, and the imperial city provides service and office for the central government. And Tang imperial city is here. They both have a, let's call them inner city, right? In Beijing, this is the inner city. And Chang'an has the city at large, right? The northern part, which is more prestigious, can be considered as a kind of inner city. And Beijing has a formal outer city, and this outer city used to have no wall. The wall was, this part of Beijing was completed in the early 15th century. But the outer city was added in the 16th century. And the original plan was to go all the way around the inner city to create a full fourth layer. But for some reason, only the southern part was completed, because at that time, the northern part was not as populated. The southern part, having the Temple of Heaven and the temple dedicated to agriculture, was more populated, so it was formally enclosed. So 4 layers of the city. The difference is how these layers are related. The Beijing is built in the heart model, for which the more prestigious layer was fully enclosed by the other layers. And the Sui Tang Chang'an is what I call the head model, for which the palace is attached to the wall. So the emperor had access directly to the exterior of the city at large. But they both feature, orientation toward cardinal direction. Both cities are quite accurately oriented north-south and dominated by a north-south axis. So Beijing also had a north-south axis, for which the imperial monuments were symmetrically arranged on both sides, and the Forbidden City is located at its center. The city of Beijing now let's take a closer look at the Palace City, also known as the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City, which is much smaller than the Tang Dynasty Palace of the Damingong or the Taiji Gong. The Tang Dynasty have two major palaces, and each of those palaces are bigger than the Forbidden City. However, if you have been to the Forbidden City, you know how big the Forbidden City is. So that just testified the much greater scale Tang Dynasty city was built in. The Forbidden City was completed during a very short time in the early 15th century by the third Ming Emperor, who relocated the capital from Nanjing to Beijing, from the south to north. It is facing south and having a main axis. The axiality and symmetry of the city is very powerfully expressed. It is an expression of the Confucian order of hierarchy. So all those buildings had clear indication of their hierarchy. The biggest building, the Hall of Supreme Harmony, occupies the center of the entire Forbidden City, and it is also elevated on 3 levels of platforms. And it is the unmistakable kind of head of the buildings within the Forbidden City. There are many courtyards. To some extent, the Forbidden City is a big courtyards, and inside there are many smaller courtyards. The largest courtyard is the 3 front hall courtyard. There are 3 major halls, and they occupy a courtyard. And then there is a rear 3 hall, which is a quarter area of the 3 front hall. So Professor Fu Xinian's research shows that there is a module not only for individual building, but also for the entire planning of the Forbidden City. For example, if you divide this big courtyard, you notice the size of the rear courtyard is that exactly that area. And further, on either side of the rear 3 hall courtyard, there are smaller courtyards. And they were roughly 1/6 of the rear 3 hall courtyards. So there was a module in the construction of the Forbidden City, and the scale of the courtyards indicate hierarchy. The front 3 courtyards, the front 3 hall courtyards was the ceremonial center of the Forbidden City. These are the buildings for court hearing and most important imperial ceremonies, while the rear three-hall courtyards was the ritual bedroom for the imperial family. These are like the sleeping chambers, and these are the ceremonial court. And according to the Book of Rites from the Zhou dynasty, the Son of Heaven has 12 consorts. So on either side of the rear courtyard, there are 6 smaller courtyards, each for a major consort, and there are 6 on this side as well. The Qing dynasty emperor, some of them has more than 12 consorts, but still Forbidden City was constructed following the Zhou dynasty kind of orthodoxy texts regulating the ritual dwelling of the Son of Heaven. So it's a building complex in terms of hierarchy, in terms of following the Book of Rites, an expression of Confucianism that had been ruling China's imperial history for 2,000 years. To some extent, the Forbidden City is a giant 四合院, or a giant 4-side courtyard known as 四合院. So this is the Forbidden City, and this is a common Beijing residence known as 四合院. Even though the Forbidden City is hundreds of times bigger than a common courtyard residence of Beijing, they express very similar spatial logic and spatial experience. In a Beijing courtyard house, the front yard is bigger, and that is also a ceremonial center of the household. The central building often double as the guest, kind of receiving room for the guests. It is also a kind of a family altar. It is during festivals, the tablets with ancestors' name would be worshipped there. And in the back, those are the sleeping chambers. So there is a transition from the public realm to the private realm, to the public, semi-public ceremonial center of the household, to the private sleeping chambers of the household. It's the same logic as the Forbidden City. And there are many, many kind of ranks in between. So a princely residence would be somewhere in between the Forbidden City and the common Beijing courtyard house. These are also basically kind of single-story construction featuring access, and from outside one could only see the wall and the gate. So to experience the beauty and drama of spatial, the spatial drama, one have to walk through to get enough experience of the whole architecture. So individual building doesn't mean that much. It is the courtyard. It is the spatial unrolling of the spatial procedure that created the interesting experience of Chinese architecture. Since the gate is the only kind of visible face of a Chinese complex, gate is very important in Chinese architecture, and it is also the most direct indicator of hierarchy, of ranks. So Ming and Qing dynasty regulations had very detailed regulations about, which rank of the society can build what kind of gate, in terms of number of bays, in terms of the color and the decoration on the door and the roof. This is the Hall of Supreme Harmony, which is this one in the plan. And it is the most important building in the Forbidden City. It was the most important building for the entire Ming and Qing dynasty China. It is the central building in the front part. This is where the emperor conducted state affairs, held ceremonies, and received officials and ambassadors. So the northern part also has its central building. It has 3 major halls. The central, the most important building is located in the southernmost location and the center of the courtyard. So that is the emperor's private residence, but the emperor rarely actually sleep there. And in the Qing dynasty, it also became mainly used as a court. So it's the rear court, because of the interior space was so huge. It's not really, it's too monumental. It's not good for a bedroom. A super big bedroom, a tiny little bed inside would like a coffin in a sacrificial funeral hall. So emperors almost always sleep in those smaller side courtyards. So that's basically a ritual sleeping chamber. It's just built to conform to the Book of Rites. And the location, size, roof style, color, layers of platform, and decoration visualize the hierarchy among buildings. For example, you can clearly see this building is higher in rank than this building. The Hall of Supreme Harmony has a 3-layered platform, and it has 11 bays on the front facade. It was considered 9 bay plus a all-around corridor. So that is referred to as a 9 by 5 bay. It has 9 bay on the front and 5 bays on the side, plus 2 corridor bays. So in total, it's 11 bays. While the hall, the Palace of Heavenly Purity, which is this one, this one it's a 7 by 5 bays, right? So it's a 7 bay plus or a corridor. So it looks like a 9 bay facade, but the Chinese convention would call it a 7 bay building. So in terms of number of bays, this is ranked down. And the difference can also be observed in terms of, the height, the platform, and the roof decoration as well. In this slide, I want to show the contrast between the ceremonial part and the actual living environment. This is a courtyard for the Hall of Supreme Harmony, right? It's vast, it's empty, it does not have trees at all. So everything is formal and artificial and communicating power and dominance. while the sleeping chamber, this is one of the small alleys in between the side courtyards. And the scale is much more human. These are a group of Northeastern students I brought to China during a Dialogue of Civilizations program in one of the previous summers. So these are, even emperor wanted to sleep in something like this instead of big space like that. So these are real living quarters in human scale, and there are trees as well. There's also a tiny little garden just attached to the north of the Palace of Heavenly Purity complex, which has more trees. Again, the comparison between the Beijing-style courtyard residence and the Forbidden City shows the same kind of spatial logic in architecture for vernacular house and for the imperial palaces. They are following the same spatial logic and having similar spatial transition and similar way of expressing hierarchy, because they were both product of a Confucian society. While Confucianism provided a system of moral code to create harmony in human society, Taoism provides a body of teaching that derives its conception and way of life from the harmony and exchange of the natural world. The kind of yin-yang relationship is mutually kind of embracing, and the opposites were considered as not that absolute, as kind of mutually completing one another. That is expressed in this yin and yang relationship. So it created a more kind of organic living environment rather than the kind of clear-cut artificial expression of the Confucian order. The most influential Taoist expression in the built environment is the Feng Shui theory. So Feng Shui literally means wind and water. It is a planning method that seeks to achieve harmony with cosmic force by analyzing the special features and energy of the land. The ideal Feng Shui, Feng Shui aimed to find the qi, or the energy, literally the breath of a site, aiming to identify that auspicious site that contains the best beneficial qi in the natural environment. So according to the Feng Shui theory, that should be a fertile, flat site, protected by a northern screening hill and embraced by southern meandering river. So an ideal Feng Shui would be embraced by water and a mountain in that environment. While Confucian architectural expression features straight axis, absolute symmetry, and hierarchy, like in the Forbidden City, while the Taoist expression in the Imperial Garden features lush nature, a lot of trees, while in the Forbidden City you barely see a tree. So here, trees, water, mountain is the main actors in the environment, while architecture was hidden in between the mountain and waters. and there is no dominating axis, all the borders are curved. Even the shape of the water and the mountain in the summer palace. This is the summer palace, Yiheyuan, built in the 18th century and repaired in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So the summer palace, like the yin-yang relationship, so if you consider mountain or land as yang and the water as yin, so that border even resembles the Taiji yin-yang relationship. And just like in the Taiji diagram, there is yin within yang, and there is yang within yin. Here there are smaller water body within the mountain area, and there are small islands within the yin area of the water body. The three islands basically directly refer to the Taoist myth of the three immortal islands in East Sea. That was considered the immortals' world. So there was a direct reference to the Taoist mythology as well. And to some extent, there is a vertical axis instead of horizontal axis in the Forbidden City. In the garden, there is a vertical axis, a tall tower that is visible at a different part of the garden. So in that organic spatial organization, there is a visual reference. No matter where you go in the vast park, you can see that vertical axis. And that is the Buddha Fragrance Tower, Foxiangge. It's a Buddhist structure. The Qing emperors were Tibetan Buddhists. And to provide visual reference so that when you are walking in the garden, you know where you are by referring to that high point in the garden. The most celebrated garden in traditional Chinese architecture actually is not the imperial garden, but the private garden, also known as the literati garden or the scholars garden. So we are going to look at some pictures from a series of literati gardens, and these gardens, the best examples are from the city of Suzhou, from an area known as Jiangnan, the area south of the Yangtze River. So I'm going to use a few slides to highlight a few features of Chinese garden. So they were, built by retired high officials who were skilled in calligraphy, poetry, and the arts as part of their education for entering the imperial bureaucracy. But after they retire from the capital, they built a garden that is creating a contrasting environment from their official environment, serving the court. And these gardens are usually attached to their residence and provide a place for contemplation as well as literati artistic activity, and a quasi-hermetic retreat from the worldly affair and court intrigues. So the same person who did painting like this would be engaged in the design and the building, and sometimes also residing of a garden like that. So this is the Zhuo Zhengyuan, or the garden of unsuccessful official. And this is a painting by the famous Ming Dynasty literati Wen Zhengming, painting the same garden. He was a good friend of the owner of this garden. And the literati garden is sometimes also referred to as the landscape garden. And the word for landscape in Chinese is Shanshui. So these are the Shanshui Yuan, or the garden of mountain and waters. While in the imperial garden, the water means lake, river, and real lake, and full-size river. While in the scholar's garden, everything is miniature. So it's a compression of natural landscape into a constrained space. The piling up of some rocks to mimic mountain. And you can see it's not higher than the house just next to it, but it is referred to as mountain. While the water is no more than a shallow pool of, reflecting water surfaces. So it was a miniature. It was a model of real nature. It was not a real nature. So in this sense, it is kind of like a three-dimensional landscape painting. You need to use your, intellectual imagination and to appreciate it to imagine. This is a key difference between literati garden and actual imperial garden. For this literati garden, architecture is integrated with nature. There are water bodies, and there are islands in the water, and there are rocks piled up to mimic a mountain or a peak. But there is always a main hall and an open platform located in the center by the water for gathering of literati activities. So it's this building in Zhuozhengyuan, and here a picture showing a platform. So this would be the place for refined gathering yaji, where people will play qin, a seventh string zither, and doing calligraphy or appreciating antiques and paintings, etc. And the spatial contrast to create a feeling of large-scale landscape is through a narrow zigzag entrance. So this is the entrance to Liuyuan, the lingering garden. So the entrance is from here. So after passing through this very narrow, relatively dark entrance area, and along the way you are enticed by the window from which you can see the bright trees and water surfaces. And after the zigzag corridors, you suddenly find yourself, in front of a water surface, and going through that contrast, that small garden and small body of water would appear bigger than it really is, right? And the one of the major skill to, one of the major standard for a successful design of a literati garden is whether you successfully conveyed the sense of real nature in a small scale, right? So the rocks and waters all were created to create an illusion of scale bigger than, a small yard. So that was partially achieved by intricate division of the space. So smaller space was divided into even smaller spaces, and thus created many, many layers. And that additional layers and the complexity created the illusion of bigger scale. If this is an empty ground, it wouldn't look that rich, that big. So it is the richness that created a sense of spaciousness. And the trick is to create layers without blocking the view, so you can see the other end. But there are many division in between. So in this case, you see the pavilion on the other side, and there is a water body, there is a bridge, and there is also trees and rocks in between. So it created, and then there's a door. So it created a feeling of distance, and that psychological feeling of distance helped to create an illusion of larger space in a rather confined backyard. Kind of similar function is also for this corridor, and these corridors are zigzagged. The passage was never direct. That zigzag elongated the time and the length of the passage, and that also helped to create an illusion of spaciousness. At the same time, it forces you to make turns while you are walking instead of just looking straight ahead. So that forces you to look at at the garden from different angle. So this is a very, very different way of passage compared to the Forbidden City. They are always straight in the middle, and instead of this kind of zigzagging. Large body of water are divided by bridges, rocks, and planting to obscure the source of the water. So when the bank is not straight, you don't have a clear sense of the size. You feel it's bigger. And without the source of the water, without seeing the bank of the water, you can always imagine that your water belongs to a much larger body, much larger water body. In private garden, architecture are usually black and white to provide the background for the nature to display their color. And something like this could be in a literati painting with bamboos and rocks. A very important building type in garden is pavilion, and in the Jiangnan Pavilion, or the southern Yangtze River Pavilion gardens, there are many gardens of different shapes, different roof styles, and different plans. They all have the window like a picture frame, and from that you can get a perfect image of a landscape painting. So the pavilions provide places of tranquility for observing the garden while being inside, and they also fit into the scene. So they are both the origin and the target of the gaze. And the garden were also, I mentioned that the architecture was basically colorless for the display of natural color. Plants chosen in respect to time of blossom, corresponding with the Chinese concept of cyclic change. And so in different season, different plants bloom and flourish. So the design of the garden need to pay special consideration for the choosing of plants and their location, and the creating kind of different atmosphere in different season and time of the year. And finally, there are balance but no exact symmetry in the garden design. So here we find a bigger building occupying a lower ground while a smaller building occupying a higher ground. They are balanced but not exactly symmetrical. And this is also very different from the Confucian palace design. And such designs sometimes also need to take into consideration the landmarks outside your own property. So that is called borrowed view. So the design of the garden rely on the on-spot design. While Confucian palaces you can draw on the board and implement on the site, but for successful garden design, experiential engagement is always the key for success. So it's unique for each garden, the arrangement of elements. The 15th century garden designer Ji Cheng, in his garden classic Yuan Ye, The Crafts of Gardens, says there's no definitive way of making scenery. You know it is right when it stirs your emotion. Kind of same emphasis on the significance of on-spot experiential engagement in the design of Chinese garden. All right, with that beautiful picture, I end this lecture. Thank you very much. I hope you learned something from this lecture, and welcome to, if you want to learn more, you can take my architecture class, Architecture 2310, which will discuss all these aspects in greater detail. That is history of Chinese architecture, a whole course just dedicated to Chinese architecture. Thank you.